All right, welcome everyone to the BC Microzonation Mapping Portal web presentation. I'm Trilby Buck. I'm the Geospatial Services Coordinator for the Business Innovation and Emergency Response Team at GeoBC and NR Data Sector Services. I'll be moderating the call today, and thanks for being here to learn about how the Metro Vancouver Seismic Microzonation project has been leading the way for comprehensive and systematic mapping of the accessible earthquake hazard mapping in British Columbia. Our presenters today will be Sherry Molnar from the University of Western Ontario, who is the principal investigator and associate professor leading the Metro Vancouver Seismic Microzonation mapping project. Gurdeep Singh, the portfolio manager for the Business Innovation and Emergency Response Team, and Julia Lax, the geospatial analyst and primary developer of the website that'll be shown today. This session is hosted by Emergency Management and Climate Readiness, who are the project champions and application owners of this initiative. I want to start the meeting with a land acknowledgement and preface that this acknowledgement is meant to take place within a larger context of genuine and continuous efforts of understanding and challenging colonial legacies. And today I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm on the traditional and unceded territories of the Lekwungen Songhees speaking peoples, now the Lekwungen speaking peoples, now known as the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations, and give respect to the historic relationships with the land that continue to this day. So today we're going to be covering a lot of ground. There's a lot of material, and it's all very interesting. We did our presentation practice run through yesterday, and despite the fact that I've been working on this portal for a year, I'm still learning new things as we get through each run through. So hopefully everyone here can learn something new today. We'll be giving you some background, and which should be everything you need to know about the basics of how to interpret and understand the different terms that we'll be covering today in terms of regional scale susceptibility and hazard mapping of the three main earthquake hazards. Then we'll be exploring the portal, so doing a demo of how the functionality works. There is a lot of rich material, so knowing how to navigate and get additional context is going to be key. Then we'll be going into case studies, specifically of Delta, the North Shore, and South Surrey. And that's really where we're going to bring all of that learning that we've just done together into really into focus on some key examples that are related to these major population sources.
Thanks for a great overview of the session today. So what you see here on the screen is a quick overview of where we are in terms of the work which is being done collaboratively by EMCR, other ministries, agencies, but also we as GeoBC as partners in all this. So at the top, you see Climate Ready BC, the platform which was launched almost 2 years ago. It's really a central gateway to resources, funding mechanisms, funding initiatives, data information tools, case studies, activities that are happening in this space when it comes to disaster risk reduction, mitigation, adaptation, all of those things. In the middle, you see different screenshots. What they represent are, so to speak, the effort which is going into establishing data and tools and solutions as it pertains to the various hazards. So what we have taken, because we are in a different space in terms of the evolution of these tools and data. So on the left-hand side, we have Extreme Heat Portal. We call it portal because it brings a different piece of information together, whether it is data, whether it is tools, whether it is resources, whether it is contextual or narrative information in terms of how to use the data, how to interpret the data. And then today we're going to talk about Seismic Microzonation portal. We also have a public-facing drought portal. We are working on the landslide portal. Flood portal is also in progression. And then finally, on the very right-hand side, we call it DCRRA initiative. The name says DCRRA portal, but that is evolving. Actually, it's going to be called hazard insights tool. It's really a collection of data when it comes to various hazards, which you see on the left-hand side of this screenshot, but also the exposure to the various values, whether it is population, infrastructure, environmental or ecosystem values. And then there's a different pieces to that, which is a story map, which will be developed. So that is work in progress. All to say that all these portals bring together various hazard information, and it's a journey that EMCR is leading in partnership with many provincial agencies, including GeoBC. And at the very bottom of the screen, you see an example of how the various communities, different levels of government, First Nations are participating in this journey, which is by not only leveraging the funding opportunities that are provided by the province and other levels of government, but also then bringing all the data and the products that are being generated through those investments, and then integrating those into extreme heat, for example, Capital Regional District, and then making it all accessible through the central gateway, which is the Climate Ready BC platform. So that's a very quick overview. And with that, I'm going to hand it over back to.
Nice to see everybody. Thanks for your time today. I'm going to talk about a bit about the project, and then Trilby and Julia have asked me to lecture to you 101 in seismic hazards. We know seismic hazard analysis is quite technical, and you need some basics to survive or get through this. First of all, it's a long title. We are doing a seismic microzonation mapping project. And so what is seismic microzonation mapping, or SMM for short? It's done around the world. Many countries in the world do seismic microzonation mapping. It is a form of seismic hazard mapping, just like our federal government creates a building code and seismic design motions and makes seismic hazard maps for the country, except for seismic microzonation mapping, we go closer to regional or local scales, where we're trying to include as much information about subsurface ground conditions and how that influences earthquake shaking into the seismic hazard mapping. So seismic microzonation mapping includes these local site effects that will happen during earthquake shaking. You can think of it as these are region-specific seismic hazard maps. They're a little better than what the national seismic hazard map is for BC. These are Southwest BC specific seismic hazard maps. They're made for particular types of seismic hazards, and there's three main seismic hazards: earthquake shaking, and we look at that in terms of amplification, or how much does the ground increase earthquake shaking intensities. And then we also look at whether or not that's going to trigger landslides or liquefaction. These are the three main hazards that are being mapped for Western Metro Vancouver for seismic microzonation maps. So these maps, again, consider the soil and basin effects. And so in order to make such good maps for the region, we have to have as much local data about the subsurface ground conditions in Metro Vancouver. So we spent 6 to 7 years collating data that was already collected by engineering firms or contractors over decades. But then the project also supported us going out every summer and collecting seismic data on the surface. And in total, we ended up with 15,000 unique locations of geodata that tells us information also with depth. And so we've created maps and had a bit of media coverage last summer, resulting in an article in the Canadian Geographic magazine that is shown over on the right. So now the next natural question might be, why are we doing this for Metro Vancouver? And the answer is, of course, we should be doing it for Metro Vancouver. It has the highest seismic risk in Canada. The next question, I guess, then is, why haven't we done it for Metro Vancouver before now? And there's two graphics here on the right that tell you how complicated it is to do region-specific seismic hazard analysis for Metro Vancouver. It's the most complicated in terms of earthquake seismicity in the country. If we did these maps for Montreal or Ottawa, we would only have to consider crustal earthquakes. But because we're in Southwest BC in an active tectonic region, we can have earthquakes that happen in the continental crust. We can also have earthquakes happening in a subducting Juan de Fuca plate. And we can also have earthquakes happen on the interface between those two plates. we have three main types of earthquake seismicity. That makes it 3 times as challenging to do the seismic hazard analyses. And then the other fun thing that I think is a huge deal to do region-specific seismic hazard maps is how is the ground going to alter earthquake shaking? Well, the ground is very widely variable in Metro Vancouver. It's the full range from end member to end member. We have very hard rock in the coast mountains, and we have the softest materials in the Fraser River Delta that are the youngest and most recently deposited. But within that span of tens of hundreds of millions of years of geologic time, we also had a depression in which sediments were collecting in the late Cretaceous, and that is now a sedimentary rock basin in which the rock or the foundations of Vancouver, Burnaby, and Surrey are founded. And then we've had glaciations come by and leave mounds of glaciated material in the North Shore and in the Vancouver, Burnaby, Surrey uplands. And then we've most recently had deposition of the Fraser River Delta. And so again, in Canada, the scope of this is crazy. We can have 300 meters of Fraser River Delta sediment sitting over hundreds of meters of glaciated sediment. So a kilometer almost to rock in Metro Vancouver. The deepest sediments elsewhere in Canada that are soft are about 100 meters. In Montreal, we're talking 30 meters. So the scale is hugely different to deal with in Metro Vancouver. And so we've needed a lot of time and effort to get this done. And so the project started in 2017 and meant to progress for 6 to 7 years and conclude in 2024. But we've always had a phased approach to inclusion of communities. And in 2023, project amendment meant that we would continue and complete all of Metro Vancouver. And so we're working on the Eastern Metro Vancouver communities as of last summer, and we'll have maps that span all of Metro Vancouver by the end of 2026. But as of the end of 2024, we had released 29 region-specific seismic hazard maps for Western Metro Vancouver. These maps are, we're going to talk about, they're going to have levels, or they can be more and more sophisticated. And some history, some background for you is that in Canada, we've been making seismic microzonation maps for a few decades, since the late 90s. Every high seismic hazard city in Canada has a form of seismic microzonation map. What we were always targeting in the past was VS30 or seismic site class. This is the one measure that is in the National Building Code to deal with site conditions. Everything about the site and how it will respond in an earthquake is in one parameter in the federal national hazard map. And that's not good enough at a regional or local scale. And so we're going to push to make really nice level 2, level 3 seismic microzonation maps, sophisticated, comprehensive, equitable, and all at once for Metro Vancouver. And so we need a lot of data, we need a lot of time, and that's going to take us quite a bit of research and innovation to get this done as well. Last thing to say is nobody's ever pushed this far in seismic microzonation mapping in Canada before. Now, everybody always thinks that the maps are risk, and they're not. They're just hazard. Meaning we are conveying where and the intensity that the event will cause damage or severity of a consequence, but we are not looking at that in terms of damage to built infrastructure or consequences to population or buildings. So we don't overlay the exposure or the vulnerability of population or built infrastructure. We are simply dealing with making hazard maps. One other way to say it is our project has created comprehensive, equitable seismic hazard mapping for the whole region, from which we expect local governments and First Nation communities to then move forward on analyzing their risk to that hazard. That we concentrated effectively on 3 seismic hazards: earthquake shaking, liquefaction, and landslides. Earthquake shaking can also lead to tsunamis. It can also lead to topographic effects. but we're not very good at dealing with topographic effects right now in seismic hazard analysis. That's too state of the art to deal with yet. 10 years from now, we'll include that in the next maps. But these are the hazards that are most commonly assessed and included in seismic microzonation mapping in the world. And so we make amplification maps, and these are a bit hard to understand in that it's not the shaking intensity in terms of, it's centimeters, the velocity of the ground at that moment, centimeters per second. This is a unitless number, it's a factor. And I think that's much more intuitive that the ground shaking is 2 times stronger here than if it was over here because of these ground conditions. And it also allows us to compare all the locations across comparatively to each other on a map. And that's why we normally use amplification as a factor or a measure in our mapping. Landslides would be the movement of material down a slope, and that could be triggered from rainfall, but it could also be triggered by earthquakes. And so our maps are looking at the seismic inducement of landslides, and also whether or not earthquake shaking would induce or trigger liquefaction, whether the ground would liquefy during earthquake shaking. That would happen when pore pressures get really high from the earthquake shaking in saturated or sandy. You need sandy material and you need water in that sandy material for it to basically liquefy. There's 2 other main concepts that are important to convey to you, is that our mapping is done in a probabilistic way, or they are not done for one particular earthquake scenario. These maps consider all the earthquakes that can happen in the region, known from the 2020 building code or our 6th generation national seismic hazard model. It's the same one that's used to do design ground motions or for the 2020 building code. That is the best knowledge about where we think earthquakes happen and how frequently. And again, that goes back to there's 3 types of earthquakes in the region and how often they happen. That is all included in our mapping. We make a probabilistic seismic hazard map that considers that for 2 different return periods. One is 475 year, so it's a shorter return period, and another is 2475, or a much longer return period. This means we're looking at whether or not shaking would be exceeded at a 10% probability of exceedance in 50 years or a 2% probability of exceedance in 50-year hazard level. For reference, the building code requires collapse prevention of buildings, new buildings, based on this 2% probability of exceedance or 2475-year return period. This is hopefully common to you in terms of like flood mapping. We deal with much longer return periods compared to wildfire or floods because we're not a seasonal hazard. Earthquakes don't have a season. They are quite rare. And so we look at these 2 different return periods that sound kind of long, but just the last take-home message is we've made maps for these 2 return periods, and I think that has a beneficial value that you can look at one map that would be for a lower intensity of shaking that would more likely happen more frequently, as opposed to what if we looked at the high intensity shaking that would be very rare but could happen in this 2475-year return period. It's helpful to have the 2 examples to compare back and forth to. It means we end up with 29 maps, too much to deal with, but it's helpful to compare these 2 return periods. One other concept that's important for you to understand is that earthquake shaking is quite dynamic. It all comes together at once, and an analogy is like a choir is singing and each person in the choir is contributing. And as the earthquake waves propagate through the ground will preferentially filter how that earthquake shaking arrives at the surface, depending on often its thickness and stiffness of that material. So long period waves, or the bass notes in the choir, arrive at the surface because we would travel through really soft sediments or a really deep sedimentary structure. And so that long period ground motion would resonate most with tall buildings. The ground and the building are both single degree of freedom systems that will resonate or oscillate based on their stiffness and thickness. So just think of it as two buildings on top of each other almost. And we don't want long period tall buildings on long period soils. Last thing is we talked about period in two ways. There's a return period that we just talked about, and now we're talking about spectral period, or what is the frequency or wavelength or spectral period of the ground motion shaking. One more lecture background information for you is that seismic microzonation mapping has levels, or it can become more and more complicated, more and more comprehensive, excuse me. And so more and more data and more sophisticated analysis will push the level or comprehensiveness of the mapping. We want to make very good, detailed, comprehensive seismic microzonation maps for Metro Vancouver. So we push to level 2 and 3. Sorry. And then level 2 is often an expression of the susceptibility of earthquake shaking or the susceptibility to liquefaction or landslide, meaning we've done our best to measure what the ground conditions are like and how that might affect earthquake shaking or liquefaction. But to get to level 3, we consider the earthquake shaking intensity. We move to these probabilistic seismic hazard maps that are made only for Southwest BC based on what waves will do as they propagate through Southwest BC ground material. A much more sophisticated and higher level than what the building code would do, or seismic, a much more comprehensive level of seismic hazard map. So quickly again, to try and explain that there are a kind of a first pass level 2 seismic microzonation maps, that these are what have been made for other cities in Canada before. We're used to this in some ways. It expresses what we know about the subsurface ground conditions. It expresses our database in the form of maps. We can give it to you in many ways. It's easy to understand what the depth to rock is. Maybe you don't know what VS30 is, but that is a very common parameter in seismic hazard assessment. And so that's a fundamental seismic hazard map that needs to be made. Basically, these level 2 maps are identifying where the ground is susceptible to the changes in earthquake shaking. But the question is how much amplification will happen, or will liquefaction or landslide be triggered? We have to then consider what the earthquake shaking would be, and we do that considering all earthquakes that will happen in a 475-year return period or a 2475-year return period. And then we push to these level 3 first ever probabilistic seismic hazard maps specific to Metro Vancouver. And these identify where the hazard occurs and also the inferred severity to which that hazard would be induced. In level 2, we're only guessing at what the inferred severity is. We went forward and did the calculation and are now giving it to you. Just how bad will it be? It's in these level 3 maps. So over to you, Julia.
Awesome. Thank you, Sherry, for that background on the project and also seismic microzonation mapping as a whole. This is a great place to lead from since these mapping levels are directly related to the structure of the portal that was based on this project. So the portal and the related application that hosts the maps is separated into tabs that correlate to these levels, where we have advanced hazard map that includes all the level 3 maps, and then susceptibility and general tabs contain level 2 maps. So for more information, users can turn to these description sections in each panel of the app. The next section of the presentation will dive deeper into the portal itself. So the portal was created by GeoBC as a method of hosting the current and future seismic microzonation mapping projects for all of BC, and then starting with the Metro Vancouver project. The portal currently features a web mapping application for Metro Vancouver, which contains all the web map versions of the project PDF maps. And then within the web mapping application, there are descriptions, explanations for each map type, but users can also explore the Learn More pages of the portal for more background information. And then the portal also contains a data catalog section where users can download the spatial data and PDFs for each map. So here is the first view of the Seismic Microzonation portal. The homepage is currently highlighting the Metro Vancouver project. However, as the site evolves, we'll have more areas of BC that have been mapped, and then those can be added to the portal. So for additional context, users can look to the Learn More pages, which have been separated into 3 categories. The first page provides background information about seismic microzonation mapping in general. It includes links to more information about the Engineers and Geoscientists BC professional practice guidelines on using the maps and also developing your own seismic microzonation maps in British Columbia. It's also where you can find the methodology details of the Metro Vancouver project itself, and then also includes information required to understand earthquake hazard mapping, like the key map categories. There's also a glossary section that users can refer to even during this presentation for referencing key terms. And then the second page contains usage guides, so it highlights how to navigate the main mapping application. And then future applications we build will follow a similar design to the Metro Vancouver mapping application, so that's why you'll see a lot of diagrams and stuff are based off that app. So the first section of the usage guide includes an annotated diagram followed by details on the information about map types. And then also down here, there are annotated videos that kind of walk through how a user would interact with each of the map types. Goes through the legend and how to interpret the different colors. So just another place where users can kind of get some guidance for interpreting the maps before going into the portal itself. And then the third page contains frequently asked questions, which will be added to as we receive feedback on the product. And then the bottom section of this page also includes the relevant links for seismic microzonation mapping in BC. But yeah, so now as we know the general portal layout, we can move into the mapping application itself for Metro Vancouver. So the mapping application opens with this disclaimer about the owners of the data in the application, but there's also limitations and qualifications in this About section that users can refer to when using the maps. So here we can see how the application is organized by those levels we were talking about. So the level of seismic microzonation mapping conveys the variation of underlying spatial data, or the mapping resolution and the sophistication of the hazard analyses between the maps. So the advanced hazard maps are those level 3 maps we were talking about. So the other level 2 maps were the basis for creating these level 3 maps, and are now incorporated into what we're calling advanced hazard maps. So in this entire application, we've divided all 29 maps for the Metro Vancouver project into these 3 categories. So advanced hazard maps involve sophisticated seismic hazard analyses, and they considered modeled input earthquake shaking scenarios, whereas susceptibility in general maps communicate improved spatial understanding of the geology in the area. So this is displayed in terms of engineering soil parameters and thereby the susceptibility to earthquake shaking, liquefaction, and landslides. So in this advanced hazard tab, we're organized into 3 earthquake hazards. So we have shaking amplification, earthquake-induced liquefaction, and landslide hazard potential. So for each category, it has a description on that general hazard. So for example, the shaking application has 2 clickable maps that refer to the 475-year return period. One for shaking amplification at short spectral periods, or rapid shaking at high frequencies, which would resonate as short buildings, as we know. And then one for long period amplification or swaying kind of shaking at low frequencies that would resonate with taller structures. And then the amplification maps are unique because they have this inset map at the bottom, and it scrolls through 3 different spectral periods within each the short and long term or long period shaking maps. So for example, here in the short period amplification map, we have amplification for 3 spectral accelerations, PGA or peak ground acceleration, 0.2 seconds, and 0.5 second spectral accelerations. And so as you click through, the map will change to reflect that. And then the same thing happens with the long period amplification map package. So it also includes 3 spectral periods. We have 1 second, 2 second, and 5 seconds. And then as we continue scrolling down, we can see that there's another short and long period amplification maps packages here. And they do look the same, but they're different because they're calculated for a longer return period. So that's the 2475-year return period, which means, again, more rare and higher magnitude earthquakes were considered in calculating these maps. And then to kind of help interpret any of the colors on the map, users can click these map explanation question marks. And there are some written explanations. And then at the bottom, there's a diagram showing the general significance of the map colors. So in this example, we can see that green areas signify regions where earthquake shaking will be weaker than the baseline soil condition. And then darker orange areas will experience stronger shaking at that same baseline. And then the legend pop-up also supports the map explanation and shows that yellow areas having an amplification value closer to 1, or in other words, a shaking level close or equal to the baseline soil condition. And then as we continue in the advanced hazard maps, we also have the basin amplification for 2 seconds and 5 seconds spectral periods. So these maps highlight the Georgia sedimentary rock basin beneath and offshore of Western Metro Vancouver. And it's important to note that these basin amplification values are merged with the long period amplification 2 second and 5 second spectral accelerations. And then the next map dropdown holds the earthquake-triggered liquefaction hazard potential maps for both the 475 and 2475-year return periods. So users can click on an area of interest in this example and identify a hazard rating in plain language from very low hazard areas shown in green to very severe hazard areas shown in deep red. And then similarly, the landslide maps are also interactive. They've been mapped for the 2 return periods. And so you can click on a polygon and have the hazard rating appear also in plain language. Hazard ratings are determined based on the predicted slope displacements due to earthquake shaking, and they're listed from low to very high hazard based on tolerable slope displacement measured in centimeters. So again, these advanced hazard maps were created using a combination of the level 2 susceptibility maps and sophisticated probabilistic seismic hazard analyses. So the level 2 maps can be found within the susceptibility in general map sections. So within the susceptibility map section, we have 4 map types. We have soil shaking susceptibility, deep basins shaking susceptibility, liquefaction, and landslide susceptibility. So soil shaking susceptibility has many variables that could affect earthquake shaking, like sediment thickness and stiffness. The first 2 maps here show the variation of sediment thickness across Metro Vancouver, the first showing the thickness of just the post-glacial sediment, while the second shows a combination of post-glacial and glacial sediment thickness, or depth to rock. These maps are important because shallow sediment tend to amplify shaking at short spectral periods, whereas thicker sediment tend to amplify shaking at longer spectral periods. And then the metric for both these maps used to distinguish between areas is meters of sediment thickness. And then the next map shows the time average shear wave velocity of the top 30 meters of surface material, which provides a summarized measure of ground stiffness and the subsequent tendency for sediment materials to amplify or de-amplify earthquake shaking. As we can see in the legend, this map shows VS30 measured in meters per second. And then the final 2 maps of this dropdown are the T0 and TPG maps, which highlight the natural period of a location based on its ground characteristics, and that's measured in seconds. So for example, areas with thicker and softer soil conditions will shake or oscillate at longer periods, and that means that ground swaying would be slower with longer oscillations, and then stiff soil conditions would lead to experience shaking or resonance at shorter periods, which means that the ground would shake quickly and vibrate faster. And then the next drop-down section focuses on the shaking susceptibility due to basin effects. So within this map, the depth to the specific shear wave velocity of either 1.5 or 2.2 kilometers per second of sedimentary basin rocks is shown in meters. So darker orange areas in the southwest depict a greater basin depth to reach that chosen shear wave velocity compared to lighter yellow areas, say, for example, in the northeast Metro Vancouver. So these maps highlight the depth and spatial boundaries of the Georgia sedimentary rock basin and indicate whether deeper areas are located and therefore more susceptible to amplifying shaking at longer spectral periods, whereas shallower areas will experience less to no amplified shaking due to that Georgia basin. And then the final two drop-downs show liquefaction and landslide susceptibility, which again are different from the hazard potential maps. They show the natural susceptibility of the ground to these hazards without incorporating specific modeled earthquake scenarios. So the liquefaction susceptibility map is based on geology, the depth to the water table, and measurements of soil resistance at over 800 locations. And then the landslide susceptibility map is based on the slope's yield acceleration calculated for two-dimensional slope models spanning representative slope conditions throughout the region with accurate slope geometry determined from high-resolution digital elevation mapping. And then finally, the last page features general susceptibility maps. So these are still level 2 maps and were used in the development of many of the other maps shown in the application. These two general maps are bedrock geology and groundwater table maps. Both are foundational in assessing ground characteristics and related effects on seismic wave behavior. So the geology map can be explored by clicking on the polygons to identify the geology of the upper tens of meters of a specific location. And then the groundwater table map shows the depth below the surface to identify the regional groundwater table in meters and is based on measurements collected over several decades, averaged to account for seasonal fluctuations. So that's a lot, and that concludes the tour of all the 29 maps that were created for the Metro Vancouver project. Once again, there is more information to explore within each of the map descriptions, the usage guides, the map explanation pop-ups, and legends. So if you're interested in learning a bit more, please feel free to explore those sections of the site. And then the data for these maps are also available in this search data catalog. I just have it preloaded here. So here users can search by map name or hazard type. And then we've also included this optional survey button that captures the general location, download date, and business area of the user accessing the data just for internal tracking purposes. And then, so once a user clicks a map from the catalog list, this new window will open up with that map item. And then users can decide based on these data access options, which format they'd like to digest the data in. So either as a local download layer package, which is compatible with ArcGIS Pro. So the user would just click this and it just downloads locally on their computer. Or the map can be added directly to their ArcGIS Online account through the Save As function when you click to open a map in Map Viewer. That is assuming they have an ArcGIS Online account, but that would be immediately put into their library. And then alternatively, if you're just looking for a singular layer, you could scroll down at the map itself, click on one of the layers here. It opens up a separate page and you can access the REST URL and bring it into a map directly. And then users also are given the option to click this hyperlink and have the PDF map download also locally on their computer. So with that, we'll return back to the slides and start exploring how these earthquake hazard maps may be used to assess overall risk.
So it's an amazing portal that Julia and team have made. And now we're going to talk about, let's pretend you live in Delta. What would it mean? How would you digest this? And what's also kind of cool is that we're looking at one map on the left, but then how that relates to the content in other maps is helpfully displayed at the same time on the right. We're looking at several maps at once. So it's going to be useful to explore specific areas as case studies to identify the various hazards and relate how these maps help us understand earthquake hazards in the region. We're also going to demonstrate how we expect end users, say local governments, to overlay or compare these hazard maps, say with their own risk information, such as exposure or vulnerability data. And we randomly just chose to go as dangerous as possible and are looking at the 24-75 year return period maps, or the most rare, highest, very strong shaking scenario. So in Delta, the map on the left you can see is quite green. And this map is telling us about the short period shaking intensity in terms of amplification. And green means it's de-amplified or less than an amplification of 1, or that the soft soils here don't shake as hard as the baseline dense soil condition, which would be amplification in yellow. And getting a sense as to the ground conditions in Delta, on the right, we can see the post-glacial sediment thickness map, which is telling us that it's quite deep, quite dark colored, and also that the post-glacial and glacial sediment thickness maps are also showing us the darkest color or the deepest depths as well. And then, so we're inside of the Fraser River Delta sediments, and they're very deep here in the city of Delta. And then are we inside of the Georgia Sedimentary Basin? Good question. You're located in Southwest BC, and yes, you are inside of the Georgia Sedimentary Basin. And the more southwest you go in Metro Vancouver, the deeper the Georgia Basin would be. And so the depth of that basin is examined as this depth to a shear wave velocity of 2.2 kilometers per second. But effectively, that's a basin depth map. So the sand and silts of the Fraser River Delta are young and soft here, and they're water saturated. They're going to be susceptible to shaking amplification and liquefaction. And in addition, we're inside of the Georgia Sedimentary Basin, so we should also be anticipating that there might be long period shaking amplification that might happen. So let's talk again about the map on the left. At short periods, the shaking will be de-amplified at these short spectral periods, very short wavelengths or high frequencies. And it's effectively telling us that the very strong shaking of this 24-75 year return period, the earthquake shaking that's being considered, is so strong that the soft soils will behave in a non-linear fashion, or they're going to tap out in terms of linear amplification. We're going to trigger nonlinear soil response in these soft sediments of the Fraser River Delta. And that means they're effectively going to begin to deform. And if these are sandy and saturated sediments, they may begin to liquefy. And if these soils are clay rich, they may begin to spread or crack. So nonlinear soil behavior reduces the intensity of earthquake shaking, meaning the shaking intensity in the delta will be less than or de-amplified compared to the shaking intensity at baseline dense soil conditions. And so de-amplification is shown by green colors, and the green is quite green here. The de-amplification factor is about 0.4, and that's conveying that the shaking will be 40% weaker than other locations that are closer to a dense soil condition in Metro Vancouver. Last but not least is a cool fact that nonlinear soil behavior is the strongest at very short spectral periods. So that's why we're showing you the worst. This is as green as the maps get at the shortest shaking PGA and at the strongest intensity of shaking, the 24-75 year return period. So your next instinctual question should be, is this straight shaking de-amplification mean that the ground is going to be liquefied? Will liquefaction be triggered or seismically induced in the delta? So since that's a good question, let's look at the liquefaction hazard potential map that Julia's pulled up for us. And so yes, on the left, we can see that strong shaking is going to lead to severe liquefaction hazard potential ratings. for this very strong earthquake shaking intensity for this rare 2475-year return period. Essentially, the soil's resistance is being greatly exceeded by the very strong shaking intensity. And extensive liquefaction will disrupt and damage the ground surface in the city of Delta. Effectively, extensive soil liquefaction at the ground surface can lead to severe settlements of structures and damage to underground services. One last caveat, though, is that our mapping is done for natural or non-engineered ground conditions, and so our maps are scarier than reality if that ground has been densified or engineered in some way. And we've known about liquefaction susceptibility in the Fraser River Delta for some time, or we've always been aware that the Delta might be susceptible to liquefaction. The map on the left is saying, yes, for sure, it will have a severe hazard potential for this very strong shaking level if you don't do something about it. But when you do something about it, the map won't be as scary. In contrast, let's flip to longer spectral periods of shaking. So we're going to explore the 2-second spectral acceleration map now. And so the map on the left isn't green anymore. Now it's orange or red. So that's telling us that shaking amplification is happening, or that the ground shaking intensity is going to be increased compared to dense soil conditions or a baseline dense soil condition. So the soft sediments of the Fraser River Delta are amplifying long period spectral shaking because you're inside of this deep Fraser River soft sediment basin. And that's going to resonate with long period shaking, similar to the way tall buildings will resonate at long period shaking too. You might also notice subtly that there is on the left that the intensity of the orange color is getting darker to the southwest or the bottom left corner. And this is the merged basin amplification included. And so if we look at the basin amplification map now, we would see how much contribution there is from long period spectral acceleration related to the basin. Overall, the long period amplification here is about a factor of 4, or that the shaking intensity is 4 times stronger than it is in yellow areas or dense soil conditions in Metro Vancouver. And that's being contributed to by the deep, soft sediments, as well as the fact that you're inside of the deepest part of the Georgia Sedimentary Basin. So that sounds scary, and we expect local governments to then overlay and talk about risk. So for example, if we overlay the exposure data like population points or vulnerability data like social vulnerability index, in general, the city of Delta has been doing a good job in making sure that nobody develops in Burns Bog, or there's not as much development in Southeast Richmond. We're not as populated there. And this signifies that although the area may have a high shaking amplification hazard at these long spectral periods, it may have a moderate to low seismic risk. And this can be further examined by overlaying other vulnerability layers, say such as infrastructure or building data, and where these same high hazard areas like Burns Bog are also free from development, which further indicates that continues to be a lower seismic risk area, but will continue to be a high seismic hazard area. So let's flip it and say you move to the North Shore. Let's have an example where you live in the North Shore. Excuse me while I cough. Sorry.
Yeah, you're covering a lot of material. Take a good drink of water there.
Yeah, that's right. I know that when you live in Metro Vancouver, you are very well acquainted with the fact that you're in mountain slope areas here. We've got a lot of terrain changes in the North Shore, very different landscape, and therefore very different kind of site conditions. Where the sediments in the ground are changing much more quickly. on the North Shore than they were in the deep kind of bowl of delta, or the Fraser River Delta. So in the basin depth map, or the depth to a shear wave velocity of 2.2 kilometers per second, and these basin amplification maps, we know that we're north of and no longer within the Fraser River Delta. Now we're at the northern edge of the Georgia Sedimentary Rock Basin here in the North Shore. And then, sorry, Julia was showing me the post-glacial and glacial sediment thickness maps. And that was also telling us that there's outcropping coast mountain rocks. The maps are kind of white to the north, and then they got deeper red towards the south. So there's a quick transition, or greater increasing sediment thickness towards the shoreline throughout the North Shore. So just realize that there's this variability in steep slopes and terrace glacial sediments throughout. And then there can be pockets of relatively young sediments that tend to be older and stiffer than the Fraser River Delta, if we're comparing, being relative. But they're deposited usually along the valley sides or as alluvial fans and small deltas at the mouths of the Seymour and Lynn valleys. So I think you appreciate, hopefully, that the North Shore has this greater range in ground conditions, so you can anticipate that there would be this greater variability in earthquake shaking susceptibility between neighborhoods than there would be in the neighborhoods in the city of Delta. Somebody lives in a block in the city of Delta, their neighbor experiences the shaking quite similar to them. But in the North Shore, there'll be these very big changes. Neighbors will experience it quite differently, the earthquake shaking. So again, we usually start with the shaking amplification map on the left, and again, looking at the shortest periods, or this peak ground acceleration shaking. Again, for this rare 2475-year return period, like we did that for Delta. And there is similar de-amplification at the shortest periods that's happening at the southern limits of the Seymour and Lynn River valleys or deltas. And so it sounds very similar to what's happening in the Fraser River Delta. Where green is happening, we get de-amplification or reduced shaking intensities, probably because we're triggering soil nonlinear behavior to be happening in relatively soft ground. And that's true in the oranges on the right, telling us that they're thick, relatively thick and soft soils present, where it's green on the map on the left. Because the North Shore Delta is located on a slope, these delta sediments are going to decrease quickly as we move up the slope to the north. And that's why you get this rapid kind of transition in the shaking amplification from green to orange. We're now seeing that shaking intensity could be increased by a factor of 2 in the orange areas. And so now you're on the terrace glacial sediment hills of North Vancouver, and these are not so soft to experience nonlinear shaking. They're going to amplify earthquake shaking as much as 2 times that of the yellow areas. So one more time is pretend you're standing in the yellow area of North Vancouver. The people to the north of you in the orange are going to say the shaking was 2 times stronger. And the people to the south, where it's green, are going to say it was maybe 50% less. And that's kind of crazy that it can happen over that short of a distance. So let's flip that now to the longer period spectral shaking map, or we just looked at the soprano notes. Let's look at the bass notes of the earthquake shaking. And so we're starting here at 1 second spectral acceleration, and we can see that there's weak amplification of around 2 light orange or less in the softer sediments of the river valleys. And the strongest amplification is still happening in that soft sediments of the river mouths along the shoreline. This spatial variation of amplification at 1 second strongly mimics or is and therefore controlled by the thickness of post-glacial sediments, the map in the top right. These 2 maps, I can immediately see how this amplification happens because I know the post-glacial sediment thickness map. But if we move to a longer 2 second spectral period, now the shaking amplification of these delta sediments is going to increase more So now you see this dark orange happening in these deltas at the end of the Seymour and Lynn valleys. And this stronger amplification is directly linked to the fact that the natural site period in these locations is closer to 2 seconds. And that's quite clear in the fundamental site period map that Julia's now just popped up for you too. Site period is one map that allows us to include 2 measures of thickness of soils and as well as stiffness of soils. So it's an awesome type of metric to have in a map, but it's less intuitive to understand in terms of it's just 5 meters of soil. 5 seconds of period, fundamental period is harder to understand. So I'm going to pretend you're now starting to understand how the variation in subsurface ground conditions is changing the amplitude of earthquake shaking intensity and how that's filtering earthquake shaking at these different spectral periods based on the thickness and stiffness of the soil. The soil is effectively acting as a filter or a tuning fork to the earthquake shaking. And maybe you're also starting to see how these level 2 maps on the right kind of feed into or directly relate to the calculated level 3 hazard maps on the left. One last thing to talk about is now that we're looking at long period shaking on the left, is there going to be long period shaking resulting from the Georgia Sedimentary Basin? So let's check, are we inside of the Georgia Sedimentary Basin? We're going to look at this basin depth map or this shear wave velocity to 2.2 kilometer per second map. And these, at the south end of the North Shore, we are at the edge or sitting on the edge or the limit of the Georgia Sedimentary Basin. And so we do have that the river deltas at the end of the Seymour and Lynn Valley are spreading out onto the edge of the Georgia Sedimentary Basin. But basically the rest of the North Shore to the north is outside or sitting is outside of the Georgia Sedimentary Basin. The Georgia Sedimentary Bowl kind of rises up a bit of the North Shore mountains, but the coast mountains are the hard rock edge that rise up and past the sides of the Georgia Sedimentary Rock Bowl. So we're not going to experience additional long period basin amplification in the northern part of the North Shore because we're basically outside of the basin now. So we've examined how earthquake shaking intensity is going to vary at different spectral periods. And we're in sloped terrain, or there's steep slopes on the North Shore. So our next natural question is, will landslides be triggered by this earthquake shaking? And our level 3 landslide hazard potential map on the left is showing you where and the severity that landslides would be triggered by this very strong shaking intensity for the 24-75 year return period. Given what we know about earthquakes that can happen in a 24-75 year return period, and what we know about the slope geometry and the strength of the soils in those slopes, will they trigger landslides? And basically, we understood that we were susceptible to landslides because it's high angle slopes. But the map on the left, as Julia is showing you, is literally the answer as to whether or not these landslides would be triggered during earthquake shaking. So many of the slopes are generally not strong enough to fail, are generally strong enough to not fail during a 475 year shaking event. But on this map, we can see actually quite a few orange to red areas, and that the very strong shaking associated with the 24-70 year shaking event. About half the slopes in the lower Lynn and Seymour River Valley changed from a low to moderate to high to very high landslide hazard potential ratings. We need a very strong earthquake to really trigger landslides to occur in the North Shore. One caveat here, though, is there's always some limitation, of course, or some qualification to the mapping. And we use a long-term, non-seasonal average to the groundwater table. So you can imagine in a dry summer, our maps might not be accurate, that the slopes that are expected to fail here might not actually be triggered to slide because they're not as wet as when we did the analysis. And conversely, you know, in a rainy spring, the slopes are wetter than what we anticipated they would be in this analysis. So the seasonality of the map cannot be included, but a long-term average is essentially what these maps convey. And then last but not least, you know, we expect the North Shore local governments to take a look at the risks now to this landslide hazard that's now been mapped, and that the darkest colors are located usually where there's park areas, or that not as much significant development has been happening at the steepest slopes of the North Shore. And that's a good thing. Let's keep doing that. Let's make sure we use this landslide hazard potential map to identify these hazardous zones and make sure we have mitigative policies or limit development where we know that the slopes are too steep or too soft to resist earthquake shaking. Well, let's do one more case study. Let's pretend you've moved now to Surrey. And Surrey gives us a good range of what's going on as well in a condensed spatial area as well. Immediate reactions are it's quite green, just like it was in South Delta. And but now the map is kind of yellowy to orange. And one last thing to say is that remind ourselves, on the left, we're looking at shaking amplification at very short periods. And so the map is yellow mostly because the glaciated uplands of Surrey are close to dense soil baseline soil condition. So our maps are yellow saying they're not going to amplify earthquake shaking, but it's still going to be the very strong shaking anticipated for this 24-75-year return period. But as we move south, we see that the colors are changing to orange because now we're making a rapid transition in elevation south towards the Serpentine Nickel River Valley. And essentially the thin Capilletto sediments here on the glacial uplands are becoming thinner, also known from our post-glacial maps on the right. And this strongly amplifies the very short period PGA shaking. So the reason it's orange on the map on the left has to do with the fact that the post-glacial soils are getting to be quite thin on the right. And then you already know or have been told about how green it is in the lowland Serpentine Nickel Valley, and the sediments are just as soft to the delta here, and therefore they would experience de-amplification or weaker very short period shaking for the same reason of triggering soil nonlinearity. And that it's good to remind ourselves we're looking at short periods, so this is going to affect shorter structures. And of course, we should have that anticipatory reaction of, oh, strong de-amplification, maybe not liquefaction might happen. But we'll talk about that more in a second. I'd rather flip it. Let's talk about long period shaking now. Let's look at the long period 2-second amplification map. And just like Delta, you know, we went from green to red. That's what's happening in the Serpentine Nickel Valley again. There's going to be strong amplification, or the intensity of shaking is going to be higher at these long spectral periods in the soft sediments of the Serpentine Nickel Valley. But we're finally also seeing amplification occurring at these long periods in the upland areas of Surrey. The map before was quite yellow. Now it's getting to be kind of a tangerine, light orange. And this is interesting to me. You know, glaciated sediments are quite stiff. Why would they be amplifying earthquake shaking? Well, that's because they're quite thick, even though they're stiff. And that's what the bottom right map is telling us. These are some of the thickest glaciated sediments in Metro Vancouver, and they can amplify earthquake shaking, which is interesting. And then although this long period amplification behavior is suggesting a higher shaking hazard level, you know, we can overlay population and infrastructure distribution We can see that these areas are generally relatively low in development and the number of inhabitants. And so the overall seismic risk in terms of damage and losses would be lower where there's less people and infrastructure on top of these hazardous areas. So the Serpentine-Nickel Valley is the orangest part of the map on the left. And that's telling us that we're seeing strong amplification at these long spectral periods. And another instinct is how much of that amplification is happening because of the deep sediments. That's the map on the bottom left. It's true, but also how much of that is coming from the Georgia Sedimentary Basin. So again, looking at that basin amplification map. And this is what's different about South Surrey or the Serpentine-Nickel Valley from Delta. You still have the same soft sediments. You still have strong soil nonlinearity or de-amplification at weak shaking, but you're further east in the Georgia Sedimentary Basin, and the amount of amplification that we expect because you're in soft soils is enough that we don't have to also include or consider the long period intense amplification that would happen from the Georgia Sedimentary Basin. That's an odd or new thing that we discovered, that you're far enough to the eastern edge of the Georgia Basin that the amount of amplification that's happening predicted by the soil conditions is sufficient for our amplification hazard mapping. So that's why the basin amplification map on the bottom right doesn't show that there's basin amplification in the Serpentine-Nickel Valley. Now, let's go back to this question of whether liquefaction would be triggered. So let's take a look at the liquefaction hazard potential map. So the sediments are just as soft as the Fraser River Delta. They're going to strongly have nonlinear response during strong shaking. But hopefully, maybe you've been to South Surrey and walked in this nice marsh environment and realized that the river here is less energetic and the sediments are going to be more silty and therefore less susceptible to liquefaction. The liquefaction hazard potential is very low or moderate in the Serpentine-Nickel Valley compared to how we saw that it was very high to severe in the City of Delta region. Last thing is that there are slopes in the Surrey uplands. So let's think about whether or not there be landslides triggered or what's the landslide hazard potential for this area. We would have basically narrow cuts or cliffs that are present in the glacial slopes of the Surrey uplands. And the colors, as you can see here, are somewhat yellow to severe reddish brown landslide hazard potential ratings. And so we would be triggering landslides to occur from this very strong shaking for the 24-75-year return period that we're considering. Although the slopes are not as steep as they were in the North Shore, or not as broad, they are cutting into older clay-rich capilano sediments, and they tend to have some strength to them that they won't trigger landslides at strong shaking levels, the 475-year return period, but they can result in triggered landslides for the 24-75-year return period or at very high shaking intensities. So hopefully this was a helpful way of interacting with the maps through these direct case study examples or pretending that you actually live in these neighborhoods. And understanding how the level 2 susceptibility maps say of sediment thickness and basin depth and groundwater saturation, that these are the foundational basis to understand the level 3 advanced hazard maps and how that controls the advanced earthquake hazards. So I'll toss it back to Trilby, I think.
Yeah, I just can't thank you enough, Sherry, for how much you've shared and like the heart and hard work that you've put into depth of understanding and care that goes into these maps. 7 years of hard work from you and your team at the University of Western and all the teams that have gone into making such comprehensive products. So this brings us to the end of our main content for the presentation today. I do want to highlight that to help develop this portal, there is a recommendation to refer to the Engineering and Geoscientist BC guidelines that are available through the portal to conduct future seismic microzonation mapping following those standards. There's funding available through the Disaster Resilience and Innovation Funding Program for communities, something to consider for localities to apply for. And it's also important to note that the level 3 hazard maps created for Metro Vancouver provide the included communities with ready-to-use hazard mapping that can be foundational data for risk analyses. And these data are all available, as Julia showed, through the data catalog on the portal website. There won't be a need to conduct additional analysis for seismic hazard mapping for the communities included in the phase 1 extent, and various formats are available. The overall goal is detailed, systematic, and comprehensive regional scale seismic hazard mapping, which is a mouthful to say, you know, we're getting really hyper-local with these data. As more areas are mapped in the province, this website is built in a modular fashion, so it can be scaled to include more areas. As the phase 2 work continues for the Eastern Metro Vancouver communities,